Welcome to this journey into the shadowed corners of American history, where the line between devotion and madness blurs beyond recognition. I'm your host, and tonight we delve into one of Louisiana's most disturbing and least known cases from the late 19th century. Before we begin, I'd like to know, where are you watching this from, and what time is it where you are? Are you alone in the dark, or surrounded by the comfort of daylight? Tell me in the comments below. Your stories of how you experience these episodes have become part of our haunted community, and I read every single one. Now, let me ask you something. What would you do if grief consumed you so completely that reality itself became negotiable? What if the boundary between the living and the dead seemed like nothing more than a suggestion, a rule meant for others, but not for you? In the autumn of 1891, in the remote wetlands of Terrebonne Parish, Louisiana, a discovery was made that would haunt investigators for decades to come. But our story doesn't begin with that discovery. It begins 11 years earlier, in 1880, when a respected French Creole landowner named Étienne Dufresne lost his wife, Isabelle, during childbirth. The baby, their fourth daughter, survived only 3 days. Étienne was 47 years old, a man of considerable means and education. His family had owned their plantation-style estate, known locally as Maison Dufresne, since the 1820s. The property sat on 63 acres of cypress swamps and sugarcane fields, isolated from the nearest settlement by 3 miles of treacherous bayou roads that became impassable during Louisiana's brutal rainy seasons. Isabelle's death devastated Étienne. According to Father Augustin Bro, the parish priest who knew the family intimately, Étienne refused to allow his wife's body to be taken to the church for the traditional Catholic wake. Instead, he insisted on keeping her at home for what he called a proper farewell. The priest's personal journal, discovered in the archives of St. Mary's Cathedral in 1953, contains a troubling entry dated November 3, 1880. Étienne will not release her. I fear for his soul. He speaks of her in present tense, as though she still breathes. The daughters watch in silence, pale as ghosts themselves. The funeral was eventually held, but witnesses reported strange circumstances. Étienne had personally prepared Isabelle's body, refusing the services of the local undertaker. At the burial, he wept uncontrollably, clinging to the coffin until his eldest daughter Marguerite, then 8 years old, gently pulled him away. What happened in the years that followed would transform the Dufresne estate from a symbol of Creole prosperity into what locals would whisper about as the Ossuary House, a place where the dead were never truly allowed to rest. By 1891, the 3 surviving Dufresne daughters had grown into young women. Marguerite was 19, Celeste 16, and Amélie 14. They were rarely seen in town. When they did appear, usually for Sunday Mass, parishioners noted their pale complexions, their outdated mourning clothes worn years past acceptable custom, and their father's controlling presence, never more than a few feet away. Then, on October 12, 1891, everything changed. A field worker named Samuel Robichaud was cutting through Dufresne property as a shortcut home when he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Through the dining room windows of the main house, he could see the family seated around the table, formally dressed as if for a grand dinner party. But there were more people at that table than the Dufresne family could account for, and none of them were moving. Not a single one. Samuel ran to the sheriff's office in Houma, babbling about what he'd seen. Sheriff Thomas Guidry initially dismissed the report as the imaginings of a man who'd sampled too much homemade whiskey. But when Samuel insisted, swearing on his mother's grave, the sheriff agreed to investigate. What they found at Maison Dufresne would become one of the most suppressed criminal cases in Louisiana history, buried in sealed records that wouldn't surface for over 60 years. But before we enter that house of horrors, we need to understand the world that created Étienne Dufresne, and the darkness that had been growing in Terrebonne Parish long before his wife ever died. To understand the horror that unfolded at Maison Dufresne, we must first understand the Louisiana of the 1880s and early 1890s, a place where old-world traditions collided with new-world isolation, creating pockets of civilization that operated by their own rules. Terrebonne Parish, located in the southeastern corner of Louisiana, was and remains one of the most geographically isolated regions in the state. In the late 19th century, it was a labyrinth of swamps, bayous, and waterways where entire communities could exist for generations with minimal contact from the outside world. The parish was predominantly French Creole and Cajun, populations that had maintained their language, customs, and Catholic faith with fierce devotion since the 18th century. The Dufresne family belonged to the Creole aristocracy, descendants of French colonists who had arrived in Louisiana in the 1780s. Unlike the Cajuns, who were primarily working-class descendants of Acadian exiles, the Creoles considered themselves the cultural elite of Louisiana. Society, they spoke French at home, conducted business in English when necessary, and viewed themselves as guardians of European civilization in the swamplands of America. Étienne Dufresne had been educated in New Orleans, studying literature and philosophy at what would later become Tulane University. He'd married Isabelle Thibodeau in 1871, a union that joined two of the most prominent Creole families in the region. For 9 years, they lived what appeared to be an idyllic life, producing 3 healthy daughters and managing their sugarcane operation with modest success. But beneath the veneer of Creole respectability, Terrebonne Parish harbored darker currents. The region was a meeting point of cultures, French Catholic tradition, African spiritual practices brought by enslaved people, and Native American beliefs from the Houma and Chitimacha tribes. What outsiders called voodoo, locals understood as a complex spiritual system that existed parallel to, and sometimes intertwined, with Catholicism. Death rituals in this part of Louisiana were elaborate affairs. The deceased were waked in the home for 3 days, never left alone, surrounded by candles and prayers. Because the water table sat so close to the surface, traditional below-ground burials were impossible. The dead were interred in above-ground tombs and mausoleums, creating cities of the dead that stood as prominently as cities of the living. But there was another tradition, spoken of only in whispers. The practice of keeping tokens of the deceased, a lock of hair, a photograph taken post-mortem, sometimes even death masks molded from the faces of the departed. For some families, the boundary between remembrance and obsession was dangerously thin. In the Dufresne family archive, preserved at the Louisiana State Museum, there exists a collection of letters that provides haunting insight into Étienne's state of mind following Isabelle's death. In a letter to his brother, Henri, dated January 15th, 1881, Étienne wrote, "They tell me I must move forward, that God has called her home. But what do they know of love? What do they know of the agony of an empty bed, of reaching for her in the darkness and finding only cold sheets? I have found ways to keep her near. The church would not understand, but God who made us in love surely does." Henri's response, if one existed, was never archived, but a notation in the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's log from March 1881 records a complaint from the Dufresne's housekeeper, a woman named Claudette Benoit. She reported disturbing activities at the estate, but refused to provide details when pressed. The complaint was noted, but never investigated. Claudette left the Dufresne employment shortly thereafter, and moved to Texas, where she died in 1902 without ever speaking publicly about what she witnessed. The isolation of Maison Dufresne cannot be overstated. The property was accessible only by a single road that wound through cypress swamps, thick with hanging moss and stagnant water. During the rainy season, which could last from May through October, the road became impassable for weeks at a time. Neighbors, in the loosest sense of the word, lived no closer than 2 miles away. This isolation was both blessing and curse for families like the Dufresnes. It provided privacy and independence, but it also meant that what happened behind closed doors stayed behind closed doors. The sheriff's jurisdiction was vast, covering hundreds of square miles of difficult terrain. Unless a crime was reported directly or became too egregious to ignore, law enforcement rarely ventured into the deep bayou properties. The Dufresne daughters were educated at home by their father after their mother's death. Previously, they had attended a small parish school run by Ursuline nuns, but Étienne withdrew them in late 1880, claiming that the journey was too difficult and that he could provide superior education himself. Father Bro noted in his journal that he had attempted to intervene, suggesting that the girls needed the company of other children, but Étienne had responded coldly, "My daughters are my responsibility. The world outside is vulgar and corrupting. They are safer with me." Parish records show that the Dufresne family maintained minimal contact with the outside world between 1881 and 1891. They appeared at Sunday Mass irregularly, perhaps once a month when weather permitted. The girls were never seen at social gatherings, festivals, or community events. Supplies were delivered to the property by merchants who reported that they were never invited past the front gate. Payment was left in a locked box, orders communicated through written notes. In the summer of 1889, an incident occurred that should have raised more alarms than it did. A traveling photographer named Marcus Webb was making his way through the parish, offering his services to prosperous families. He stopped at Maison Dufresne and was, surprisingly, invited inside by Étienne, who commissioned a family portrait. Webb later told the story at a Houma tavern, a tale that was dismissed as drunken exaggeration. He claimed that the house was filled with photographs of the deceased Isabel, dozens of them, displayed in every room. More disturbing, he said he was asked to photograph the family in the dining room, seated at a table set for 6 people, though only 4 were present. When he inquired about the empty place settings, Étienne had smiled and said, "We always set places for those who remain with us in spirit." The photograph Webb took that day was never found. He left Terrebonne Parish the following morning and refused to discuss the Dufresne again, even when pressed by curious locals. By 1891, Marguerite Dufresne was of marriageable age. According to later testimony, she had somehow managed to meet a young man named Philippe Arsenault during one of the family's rare trips to town. A courtship had begun, conducted primarily through letters. When Marguerite informed her father in September 1891 that Philippe had proposed marriage and she had accepted, Étienne's reaction was described by Céleste in a deposition given years later as like watching a man possessed by demons. 3 weeks after announcing her engagement, Marguerite Dufresne disappeared. On the morning of September 28, 1891, Philippe Arsenault arrived at the Terrebonne Parish Sheriff's Office in a state of extreme agitation. He had not heard from Marguerite in over a week, despite her promise to write him every other day. His letters to her had gone unanswered. When he had attempted to visit Maison Dufresne 3 days prior, he found the front gate locked and no one responding to his calls. Sheriff Thomas Guidry recorded Philippe's complaint in his daily log. Young Arsenault insists something is wrong at the Dufresne property, claims his fiancée has vanished. I advised him that family matters are often complicated and that perhaps the Father disapproves of the match. Philippe insists this is different, says Marguerite feared her father, will monitor situation. Philippe was not easily dismissed. He was the son of a prominent merchant family in Houma, educated and well-connected. He began making inquiries throughout the parish, asking anyone who might have contact with the Dufresne family if they had seen Marguerite. The responses were troubling. No one had seen any of the Dufresne women in over 2 weeks, not even at Mass. On October 4th, Father Bro added his own concerns to the growing unease. He visited Sheriff Guidry personally, bringing with him his private journal. "I have watched that family for 11 years, the priest told the sheriff, and I have documented behavior that disturbs me greatly. Étienne Dufresne is not well in his mind. He has not been well since Isabelle died. I fear for those girls." The journal entries Father Bro shared were deeply unsettling. From May 1883, Étienne speaks of his wife, as though she still lives. He sets a place for her at meals. He holds conversations with empty air. The daughters have learned to participate in this delusion, responding to their mother when their father indicates they should. From November 1886, I attempted to bless the house today. Étienne became violent when I tried to enter certain rooms. He physically barred my way to the second floor. I glimpsed something through a doorway, a figure in white, seated in a chair by the window. It did not move. When I asked who it was, Étienne slammed the door and escorted me out. I am forbidden from returning. From August 1890. Marguerite confessed to me today, weeping. She would not tell me specifics, only that she is afraid. She said, "Father, my mother won't rest. He won't let her rest." I tried to get her to explain, but her father appeared and took her away. She looked back at me with such desperation. Sheriff Guidry could no longer ignore the mounting evidence. On October 11th, he organized a small party to visit Maison Dufresne, himself, his deputy Léon Thibodeau, Father Bro, and Philippe Arsenault. They arrived at the property in late afternoon, when the Louisiana sun hung low over the cypress trees, casting long shadows across the overgrown grounds. The estate showed signs of neglect. The sugarcane fields were choked with weeds. The fence surrounding the property had fallen in places. Spanish moss hung so thickly from the oak trees lining the drive that it created a tunnel of green-grey gloom. The house itself, a 2-story structure with wide galleries and tall windows, looked abandoned, its white paint greying and peeling. Sheriff Guidry's official report, filed October 12, 1891, describes what happened next. Approached the main house at approximately 4:30 p.m. No response to repeated knocking. Deputy Thibodeau walked the perimeter and reported seeing movement through a rear window. We announced our presence as law enforcement and demanded entry. After several minutes, the door was opened by Monsieur Dufresne. What the report doesn't capture, but what Father Bro later described to his bishop, was Étienne's appearance. The man who opened the door looked decades older than his 58 years. His hair had gone completely white. His clothes, though once fine, were stained and disheveled. His eyes, the priest noted, were feverish and wild, like an animal backed into a corner. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" Étienne demanded, in French. When Sheriff Guidry explained they were investigating Marguerite's disappearance, Étienne's face contorted with rage. "My daughter has not disappeared. She is unwell and requires rest. She cannot receive visitors. I must ask you to leave my property." Philippe stepped forward. "I demand to see her. If she is ill, let me see her and verify she is being cared for." "You have no rights here," Étienne hissed. "This engagement is broken. Marguerite has reconsidered. She wishes to remain with her family." "Then let her tell me herself," Philippe insisted. The confrontation escalated. Sheriff Guidry, exercising his authority, informed Étienne that he would be entering the house to verify the welfare of all three daughters. Étienne attempted to physically block the doorway, but Deputy Thibodeau, a large man, gently moved him aside. What they found inside the house would be documented in testimony, depositions, and eventually sealed court records that would remain classified for decades. The interior of Maison Dufresne was a shrine to the dead. Every surface held photographs of Isabelle Dufresne. Dozens of them, perhaps over 100, in ornate frames. Portraits, candid shots, photographs of her in life and, disturbingly, what appeared to be post-mortem photography, a Victorian practice of photographing the deceased. The dining room was set for 6. Fine china, crystal glasses, silver cutlery, all arranged with meticulous care. Candles had burned down to stubs in their holders. A meal, long since rotted, sat on the plates covered in mould and swarming with flies. Father Bro blessed himself. Philippe looked ill. Sheriff Guidry demanded to see the daughters immediately. Étienne, defeated, led them upstairs. The smell that met them was overwhelming. Decay, chemical preservatives, and something sweet and rotten that defied description. Deputy Thibodeau covered his mouth with his handkerchief. There were 6 bedrooms on the 2nd floor. Étienne opened the door. To the first. Inside, sitting in a chair by the window, was a figure in a white dress. The dress was elaborate, the kind worn for formal occasions. The figure's hair was arranged in an intricate style, adorned with dried flowers. But the figure was not alive, could never be alive again. It was a corpse, preserved through amateur embalming, positioned as though waiting for someone to return. Before anyone could react, before anyone could process what they were seeing, a scream erupted from somewhere deeper in the house. A woman's scream full of terror and desperation. It was Celeste. Sheriff Guidry drew his weapon and ran toward the sound, the others following. They found themselves in a bedroom at the end of the hall, where Celeste Dufresne, pale and trembling, stood pressed against the far wall, pointing at her father with a shaking hand. "He killed her," Celeste sobbed. "He killed Marguerite. He killed her and he won't let her go. He never lets any of them go." Tell me in the dew, in comments, what you think is happening so far. What do you believe Étienne has done? Are Celeste and Amélie victims, or have they been complicit in their father's madness? Your theories fuel our community's investigation into these dark corners of history. Behind Sheriff Guidry, Étienne Dufresne began to laugh. It was a sound that none of the men present would ever forget, high-pitched, broken, the laugh of a man who had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. "They never leave," Étienne whispered. "Love is eternal. Death is the lie. I have proven it." Sheriff Guidry ordered Deputy Thibodeau to restrain Étienne Dufresne, while he and Father Bro attempted to calm Celeste. The young woman was hysterical, her words tumbling out in a mixture of French and English, barely coherent. Philippe stood frozen in the doorway, his face drained of all color. "Where is Marguerite?" Sheriff Guidry demanded, gripping Celeste's shoulders gently but firmly. "Where is your sister?" Celeste pointed downward toward the floor. "Below," she whispered, "in the preparation room, with the others." The others. Those 2 words would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. Étienne, restrained by the deputy, had stopped laughing. He now wore an expression of eerie calm, almost serenity. "You don't understand," he said quietly. "None of you understand. I am preserving them, protecting them from the corruption of the world, from the decay of time. They are perfect now, eternal." Father Bro made the sign of the cross and began praying in Latin. Sheriff Guidry's official report describes the discovery of the cellar access. Found concealed door behind pantry shelving in kitchen. Wooden stairs descended approximately 12 feet into foundation. Strong chemical odor emanated from below, required lamp for illumination. What the report does not convey is the physical revulsion all four men experienced as they descended those stairs. The smell was overwhelming. Formaldehyde, decay, sulfur, and beneath it all, the sweet, sick odor of death attempting to be masked. Deputy Thibodeau vomited twice before reaching the bottom. The cellar had been converted into what could only be described as a workshop of the macabre. The space was perhaps 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, with a low ceiling supported by timber beams. Shelves lined the walls, filled with bottles of chemicals, tools, surgical implements, and journals. A long wooden table dominated the center of the room, stained dark with substances best left unidentified, but it was the far corner that drew their horrified attention. There, arranged as if in a grotesque tableau, were 3 glass-fronted display cases. Inside each case was a body, preserved and dressed, positioned in lifelike poses. The preservation was crude, but effective enough that features remained recognizable. The leftmost case contained a woman in her 30s, wearing an elaborate blue gown. Her hair was styled in the fashion of a decade prior. Even in death, even through the distortion of amateur preservation, her beauty was evident. Étienne Dufresne, dead for 11 years, yet positioned as though she might stand and walk at any moment. The middle case held a small bundle wrapped in white christening clothes. The infant who had survived only 3 days. The rightmost case, the one that made Philippe Arsenault collapse to his knees in anguish, contained Marguerite Dufresne. She wore her mother's wedding dress. Her hands were folded across her chest, holding a bouquet of dried roses. Her eyes had been sewn shut. Her lips had been painted into a peaceful smile. Sheriff Guidry's hands shook as he wrote in his notebook. Father Bro wept openly, his prayers becoming incoherent sobs. On the table lay journals, dozens of them, filled with Étienne's meticulous handwriting. Sheriff Guidry forced himself to read the most recent entries, dated just days before. September 24th, 1891. Marguerite resists her elevation. She clings to the illusion of a life beyond these walls, to the fantasy of marriage to that boy. She does not understand that I am saving her. The world would corrupt her, age her, destroy her beauty. Here, with me, she will remain perfect forever, just as Isabel has. September 26, 1891. The process is more difficult with the living. They struggle, but the laudanum helps. I have perfected the mixture. She will sleep, and when she wakes, she will be transformed. She will be grateful. September 27th, 1891. It is done. Marguerite is at peace now. The transition was gentle. I held her hand throughout. She called for her mother at the end, and I told her that Isabel was waiting. They are together now, in a way. My collection is nearly complete. Philippa had to be physically carried from the cellar. He was screaming, a sound of pure grief that echoed through the cursed house. But the horrors were not yet fully revealed. While Deputy Thibodeau took Étienne into custody, and Father Bro administered last rites over Marguerite's preserved corpse, Sheriff Guidry methodically collected the journals that lined the cellar shelves. There were 43 of them in total, spanning 11 years of Étienne Dufresne's descent into madness. The earliest entries from late 1880 documented a man in the grip of overwhelming grief. They were almost sympathetic in their raw emotion. I cannot breathe without her. The house is a tomb. The girls cry for their mother, and I have no comfort to offer them. How does one survive this? How does one continue when half of oneself has been torn away? But within months, the tone began to shift. By March 1881, Étienne was writing about visiting Isabel's tomb almost daily. He described cleaning her burial vault, leaving fresh flowers, and eventually, in an entry that made Sheriff Guidry's blood run cold, something more. April 12th, 1881. I have brought her home. The church has her body, but not her spirit. I will not allow her to lie alone in that cold stone vault. I have learned techniques from medical texts. Preservation is possible. The Egyptians knew this. The saints are incorruptible. Why should my beloved suffer the indignity of decay? The journals documented Étienne's growing obsession with preservation techniques. He had somehow acquired medical textbooks on embalming, books on taxidermy, even ancient texts describing Egyptian mummification. He experimented with chemical formulas, recording his failures and successes with scientific detachment. But alongside the technical notes were passages that revealed a mind fracturing under the weight of isolation and grief. He began to write about Isabel as though she were still alive, describing conversations they had, meals they shared, nights they spent together. The line between memory and delusion blurred and then disappeared entirely. November 3rd, 1883. Isabel looks beautiful tonight. I have dressed her in the green gown she wore to the Thibodeau ball in 1876. She is pleased with my attention to detail. The girls join us for dinner each evening now. They understand that their mother remains with us. Celeste set an extra place without being asked. She is learning. December 25th, 1885. Christmas with my complete family. Isabel sits at the head of the table, radiant as always. The girls sang carols. Our infant daughter, whom I have named Marie-Claire, is with us now. I was able to retrieve her from the parish cemetery without detection. No child should be alone in the ground. The family is reunited. The journals revealed that Étienne had exhumed his infant daughter's body in 1885 and added her to his collection. This information had never been reported. The tiny grave had been in a remote corner of the cemetery, rarely visited. But it was the entries from 1889 onward that showed the complete dissolution of Étienne's sanity and the evolution of his obsession from preservation into something far more disturbing. February 14th, 1889. Isabel grows cold at night. I warm her with my body. She does not speak, but I know her thoughts. She wants me close. She has always wanted me close. Death has not changed the essence of our love, only its expression. I am her husband in all ways. The marriage vows said until death, but I have proven death is merely a transition, not an ending. The implications were clear and horrifying. What had begun as grief-stricken preservation had transformed into necrophilic obsession. Étienne was not merely keeping his wife's body, he was maintaining a grotesque parody of their marriage, one that included physical intimacy with her corpse. June 7th, 1890. I have read about the Egyptian pharaohs who were buried with their wives, their servants, their treasures. They understood that love transcends the physical realm. I am building something similar here. When my time comes, we will all remain together, preserved for eternity. The girls understand their roles. They will join us when the time is right. They are being prepared. This last entry was particularly chilling given what had happened to Marguerite. Sheriff Guidry realized he was reading the blueprint for familicide, a father who planned to murder his remaining daughters and add them to his collection of the dead. But there was another element to the journals that became apparent as Sheriff Guidry read deeper. Étienne had not been working entirely alone. August 19th, 1891. Celeste assists me now in the preparation room. She has steady hands and does not flinch at the necessary procedures. She understands the importance of the work. Amélie is still too young, too squeamish, but she will learn. They are good daughters. They honor their mother by helping me preserve her beauty. The possibility that the daughters had been complicit, whether through coercion, manipulation, or genuine belief in their father's delusions, added another layer of horror to the case. Were they victims, or had they become enablers of Étienne's madness? Sheriff Guidry knew he needed to interview both surviving daughters immediately, separately, and with great care. Celeste and Amélie Dufresne were removed from Maison Dufresne on the evening of October 12, 1891, and taken to the home of Father Bro, where the priest's housekeeper, an elderly woman named Madame Rousseau, could provide care for them. Both girls were malnourished, pale to the point of transparency, and exhibited signs of severe psychological trauma. Celeste, at 16, was interviewed first. The deposition, taken by Sheriff Guidry on October 14th with Father Bro present as witness, provides a harrowing account of life inside the Ossuary House. According to Celeste's testimony, the nightmare had begun gradually after their mother's death. At first, their father's behavior seemed like normal grief. He kept Isabel's rooms exactly as she had left them. He spoke of her, often. He wept at night, but then he began speaking to her, not about her, to her, as though she were present in the room. He would set a place for her at meals. He would pause in doorways, as if allowing her to pass through first. He would laugh at jokes only he could hear. The girls, young and frightened, had learned to play along. It seemed to comfort their father, and they desperately wanted him to be happy again. They would say, "Good morning, maman," to empty air. They would pretend to hear her responses. It became a family ritual, a shared delusion that felt safer than confronting their father's fracturing mind. Then, approximately a year after Isabel's death, their father brought something home from the cemetery. He didn't explain what he had done, but the girls knew. Their mother's place at the table was no longer empty in the same way. There was a presence in the house, a physical presence, kept in a locked room upstairs. Celeste's testimony becomes fragmented at this point. Her memories clearly traumatic. She described being forbidden from entering certain rooms. She described chemical smells that permeated the house. She described her father spending hours, sometimes entire days, in the locked bedroom with their mother. When she was 13, Celeste made the mistake of opening the locked door. What she saw would haunt her forever. Her mother, dressed and positioned in a chair, preserved but obviously dead, her father kneeling before her, holding her lifeless hand, whispering words of love. Étienne had not punished Celeste for the intrusion. Instead, he had invited her to stay. "Your mother wants to see you," he had said. "Come, tell her about your day." And so began Celeste's induction into her father's world of the dead. Over the following years, as Étienne's preservation techniques improved and his obsession deepened, Celeste was gradually brought into his confidence. He taught her to mix the chemicals. He explained the importance of maintaining the bodies, of dressing them, of positioning them in lifelike poses. He framed it as an act of love, of duty, of devotion to family. He made it seem normal, Celeste testified, tears streaming down her face. He said we were honoring maman. He said other families abandoned their dead, but we were keeping ours close. He said it was our special calling. And I was so young, I believed him. Or I made myself believe him, because the alternative was too terrible. When their infant sister was brought home from the cemetery, Celeste had been too afraid to question it. When her father began speaking of preserving the family, she had pushed the implications from her mind. She lived in a state of constant denial, knowing something was deeply wrong but unable to confront it. Then Marguerite announced her engagement. Celeste's testimony about those final weeks is particularly disturbing. Father changed when Marguerite told him about Philippe. He became possessive, angry. He said Marguerite was betraying the family, betraying maman. He said she wanted to leave us, to abandon us the way death had abandoned us. I tried to warn her. I told her to run, to leave in the night and never come back. But she said she couldn't abandon me and Amélie. She said she would reason with father, make him understand. What happened next was recounted through Celeste's sobs. Marguerite had confronted their father 3 days after announcing her engagement. The argument had been vicious. Étienne had accused her of selfishness, of corruption by the outside world. Marguerite had responded by calling her father insane, by threatening to go to the authorities, by demanding he release his hold on the family. That night, Étienne had prepared tea laced with laudanum. All 3 girls had drunk it, unsuspecting. Céleste and Amélie had awakened the next morning groggy but alive. Marguerite never woke up. He killed her, Céleste whispered in her deposition. He poisoned her, and then he brought her down to the preparation room, and he worked on her body for 3 days. He made her beautiful. He dressed her in Maman's wedding dress. He positioned her in the case next to Maman and the baby. And then he told me and Amélie that Marguerite had chosen to stay with the family, that she had ascended to a higher state, that she was happy now. Sheriff Guidry asked the question that had to be asked. Did you help him? In the preparation room with Marguerite's body, did you assist? Céleste's silence lasted. Nearly a full minute before she answered, in a voice barely above a whisper. He made me hold her hands while he injected the chemicals. He said it was my duty as her sister. He said I was saying goodbye. I didn't know what else to do. I was so afraid. I thought if I refused, I would be next. Étienne Dufresne never stood trial for the murder of his daughter Marguerite. On November 3rd, 1891, while being held in the Terrebonne Parish jail awaiting grand jury proceedings, he was found dead in his cell. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure, but the attending physician noted in his private records that Étienne had somehow obtained a quantity of arsenic. Whether it was suicide or whether someone had provided him the means to escape justice remains a matter of speculation. Father Bro conducted a private burial in an unmarked grave in the far corner of St. Mary's Cemetery. No mourners attended except the priest himself and the gravedigger. The location of Étienne's final resting place was deliberately left unrecorded in parish registers, a decision made to prevent the grave from becoming a site of morbid curiosity. The bodies of Isabelle, Marie-Claire, and Marguerite Dufresne were given proper Catholic burials in the Dufresne family tomb. Father Bro performed extensive purification rituals before allowing the remains to be interred. He wrote in his journal that he had never felt the presence of evil as strongly as he did while blessing those bodies, adding, "I pray their souls have found peace, though I fear what Étienne did to them in death may have bound them to suffering even beyond the grave." Céleste and Amélie Dufresne were placed in the care of distant relatives in Baton Rouge. The court sealed all records pertaining to the case, citing the need to protect the surviving minors from public scrutiny and scandal. For decades, the events at Maison Dufresne were known only through whispered rumors in Terrebonne Parish, stories that grew, increasingly distorted with each retelling. Maison Dufresne itself stood abandoned. The property remained in legal limbo, tied up in courts, as various relatives disputed ownership while simultaneously wanting nothing to do with the cursed estate. Local children were warned to stay away, told that the house was haunted by the spirits of the dead who had been imprisoned there. But the story doesn't end in 1891. Over the following decades, fragments of information would emerge, each piece adding new dimensions of horror to an already nightmarish case. In 1924, a professor of anthropology from Tulane University named Dr. Robert Kensington gained access to the sealed court records while researching a book on death rituals in southern Louisiana. What he found shocked him so profoundly that he abandoned his research entirely. In a letter to his department chair, he wrote, "I have looked into an abyss of human depravity that I did not know existed. Some things are better left buried in archives. Some stories serve no purpose in being told." Dr. Kensington did, however, share one discovery with a trusted colleague. Among Étienne's possessions confiscated by the sheriff, there had been a ledger documenting purchases of chemicals and preservation supplies dating back to 1879, a full year before Isabel's death. This suggested that Étienne had been planning, studying, preparing for preservation work even before he had a body to preserve. The implications were staggering. Had he somehow hastened his wife's death? Had the difficult childbirth been as natural as everyone assumed? No evidence was ever found to support foul play in Isabel's death, but the timeline raised disturbing questions that could never be answered. In 1947, a group of children from Houma, daring each other to explore the abandoned Dufresne property, made a discovery that would bring the case back into public awareness. While exploring the overgrown grounds, they found a section of the old cellar that had collapsed, revealing a hidden subchamber that had not been discovered during the original 1891 investigation. Inside this chamber were more bodies. The coroner's report identified remains of at least 4 individuals, 2 adult women and 2 men, in various states of preservation. None could be positively identified, as decomposition had progressed too far in the intervening decades. But their presence raised a horrifying question. Had Étienne Dufresne killed others beyond his own daughter? Sheriff's records from the 1880s showed several missing person reports filed in Terrebonne and surrounding parishes. Transients, travelers passing through, a domestic worker who had vanished after being employed by a prosperous Creole family. The reports had never been connected, never investigated with any thoroughness. People disappeared in the bayou country all the time. It was easy to blame the swamps, the wildlife, the dangerous terrain. But now, with the discovery of these additional bodies, a darker picture emerged. Had Étienne been practicing his preservation techniques on victims before using them on his own family? Had Maison Dufresne been a hunting ground as well as a tomb? The 1947 discovery prompted the state to conduct a more thorough investigation of the property. What they found turned a murder case into something approaching a mass grave. Scattered throughout the 63 acres were burial sites, some marked with crude stones, others completely concealed. In total, investigators uncovered remains of 9 additional individuals beyond the Dufresne family members. The case was reopened, but with both Étienne and all contemporary witnesses long dead, it proved impossible to determine the full scope of his crimes. The bodies were buried in a mass grave, blessed by the current parish priest, and the Dufresne property was finally seized by the state and burned to the ground in 1949. But even fire could not erase the memory of what had happened there. In 1973, a graduate student in psychology named Amanda Forster conducted interviews with elderly residents of Terrebonne Parish for her dissertation on collective trauma in small communities. She located Amélie Dufresne, then 76 years old, living under her married name in a care facility in Mississippi. Amélie had never spoken publicly about her experiences at Maison Dufresne. She had spent 62 years trying to forget. But something about Amanda's gentle approach, or perhaps simply the weight of carrying such secrets for so long, prompted her to finally break her silence. The interview, preserved in the Tulane University archives, is fragmentary and often incoherent, as Amélie's mind had begun to fail. But certain passages are crystal clear, spoken with the precision of someone recounting trauma that never fully faded. Celeste died in 1903, Amélie told Amanda. She was only 28. They said it was influenza, but I know the truth. She never recovered from what we lived through. She was haunted, not by ghosts, but by guilt. She believed she should have saved Marguerite. She believed she was complicit in our father's evil. The last time I saw her, weeks before she died, she told me she could still smell the chemicals from the preparation room. She said she scrubbed her hands until they bled, but she could never get them clean. When Amanda asked about Étienne's state of mind, whether Amélie believed her father had known what he was. Doing was wrong. Amélie's response was chilling. He knew, of course he knew. He would quote scripture to justify it, passages about eternal love, about the resurrection of the body. He would cite philosophers who wrote about transcending death through will alone. But in his lucid moments, which became rarer as the years passed, I saw the knowledge in his eyes. He knew he had become a monster, but his love for our mother was stronger than his sanity, stronger than his morality. He chose her, preserved and dead, over everything else, including us, his living daughters. Amanda asked one final question. Do you believe your father loved you? Amélie's answer, he loved us enough to want us to stay forever, and that was the most terrifying love of all. Étienne Dufresne died 3 months after giving that interview, taking with her whatever additional secrets remained from those years of horror in the isolated mansion where the dead were worshipped and the living were slowly consumed. The case of Étienne Dufresne and the Ossuary House remains, to this day, one of the most disturbing and psychologically complex crimes in Louisiana history. The sealed records were finally opened to researchers in 1995, more than a century after the events transpired, revealing the full scope of horrors that had been deliberately hidden to protect the surviving family members and spare the community from the weight of knowing what had existed in their midst. But even with access to journals, depositions, photographs, and forensic reports, certain questions remain unanswered. The case resists easy categorization, refusing to fit neatly into our understanding of criminal pathology. There are, broadly speaking, 3 theories that attempt to explain what happened at Maison Dufresne between 1880 and 1891. The first theory holds that Étienne Dufresne was a man destroyed by grief who descended into genuine psychosis. According to this interpretation, he truly believed he was preserving his family out of love, that he had discovered a way to transcend death itself. His journals show a progression from rational mourning to magical thinking to complete delusion. Proponents of this theory point to the lack of any prior history of violence or deviance in Étienne's life. He had been, by all accounts, a devoted husband and father before Isabelle's death. They argue that his crimes were the result of untreated mental illness exacerbated by isolation, not inherent evil. The second theory is darker. It suggests that Étienne's obsession with preservation and his necrophilic practices may have predated Isabelle's death, that the chemicals purchased in 1879 indicate premeditation. Some researchers believe Isabelle's death during childbirth may not have been entirely natural, that Étienne may have allowed or even caused complications that led to her demise in order to possess her in the way he had perhaps long fantasized about. The additional bodies found on the property support the theory that he was a serial killer who used the guise of grief to mask his true nature. In this reading, Marguerite's murder was not an act of desperate preservation, but the culmination of a long-standing pattern of violence. The third theory, and perhaps the most unsettling, is that Étienne Dufresne was neither entirely insane nor entirely calculating, but something in between, a man who chose his delusions consciously because they allowed him to justify desires he knew were wrong. This theory holds that he was aware of the evil he was committing, but constructed an elaborate psychological and philosophical framework to absolve himself. His citations of scripture, his references to Egyptian pharaohs, his claims of transcendent love, all of it was, according to this view, a carefully built scaffolding of rationalization. We will likely never know which theory is correct, or if the truth lies somewhere between all 3. What we do know is that Étienne Dufresne created a house of death where the natural order was inverted, where the dead were treated as living and the living were treated as future additions to a collection. We know that at least one daughter was murdered, that multiple unidentified victims were found on the property, and that two young girls spent their formative years in an environment of unimaginable psychological horror. We also know that the effects rippled outward for generations. Celeste died young, consumed by guilt and trauma. Amélie lived 60 years longer, but never truly escaped. The Dufresne name became synonymous with horror in Terrebonne Parish, causing distant relatives to change their surnames and deny any connection to the family. The land where Maison Dufresne once stood remains empty to this day. No one has ever attempted to build there. Local residents claim the ground itself is cursed, that nothing grows properly in the soil, that animals avoid the area. Whether this is literal truth or the power of collective memory, shaping perception is impossible to say. On certain nights, particularly in October, when the air grows cool and fog rolls in from the bayou, people driving past the old Dufresne property report seeing lights in the distance where no lights should be, as though candles are burning in windows that no longer exist. They report the smell of flowers and chemicals mixing in the air. They report, though few will admit it openly, the feeling of being watched by eyes that should have closed more than a century ago. Are these stories true, or are they simply the way communities process trauma too large to forget? Are the Dufresne women still trapped somehow in that place where they suffered, or have their spirits finally found the peace that was denied them in life? To this day, no one knows the truth. What we can say with certainty is that the Ossuary House stands as a reminder that the darkest horrors are often domestic, hidden behind closed doors in isolated places where no one thinks to look. It reminds us that love, when twisted by obsession and unchecked by reason, can become indistinguishable from its opposite. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable question: how many other houses of horror exist even now in remote corners of the world, where the boundaries between love and possession, between devotion and desecration, have been erased entirely? If this story has disturbed you, challenged you, or made you think differently about the nature of grief and obsession, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. What do you believe drove Étienne Dufresne? Were Celeste and Amélie victims or accomplices? And most importantly, what should we learn from this tragedy? If you found this investigation compelling, please subscribe to our channel and ring the notification bell to join our haunted community. We delve into the darkest corners of history every week, bringing you stories that challenge our understanding of human nature. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly dead. Sometimes it's not even past. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and stay safe out there.